Batty, lovely to see you. Emeritus Professor of Planning at UCL. We've known each other for quite a long time through association with Peter Allen. Lovely to see you again. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. I'm interested in how you theorize about complexity theory. I know that you've worked a lot in cities and have produced, amongst many other things, 2 books, Cities and Complexity in 2005 and The New Science of Cities in 2013. And I always associate your work with looking at power laws and fractals as a kind of underpinning to the kind of patterns you might find. But could you say a bit more about that? You know, what is your theoretical basis for the work that you do?
Yeah, well, I mean, like many people, like most people really, you tend to be prisoners of the time when you were trained, really, and that dates back to being a student, really. And I was trained as an architect planner, basically, originally. So it's very obvious that my interest in cities has continued throughout my life in that sense. But in the time when I was a student at Manchester in the 1960s, we in the program there, you did 3 years and you were either destined to be an architect or a planner, basically. And it so happened I chose planning after the 3 years of the 3 initial years of architecture. And planning was, to some extent, going through a very radical change at the time. It was becoming, in quotes, scientific, in the sense that rather than sort of, you know, the master planner sort of looking at the city and pronouncing what it should be like visually, basically, the notion of the city as being an efficient system and so on, all of the things that have been said by many of the commentators on complexity about how the social sciences emerged really in a more quantitative manner in the 1960s, these were all affecting us. And to some extent, the great mantra of those times was the systems approach, really. And of course, the systems approach, in my view, was developed particularly explicitly in subject areas that were really rather weak intellectually and formally and so on. So, for example, you found sociology, political science and so on, imported systems theory, planning and cities were thought about as systems and so on, parts of psychology were, and all of this kind of thing. Well, that's a well-known sort of story. But the systems approach was very much top-down. And I continued to follow this. And my working focus was really on building computer models of cities, basically. But the wider context was that I continued to follow the systems approach, which sort of fell into disrepute fairly quickly, and was replaced really in the 1970s and then certainly in the 1980s by the notion of thinking about systems not from the top down, but from the bottom up. The notion that rather than the city being like a machine, which many people had thought of it in the 60s, it was more like a sort of organism, a biological system, really. And that resonated with a lot of things which cities, there's a famous book in 1900 by Patrick Geddes called Cities in Evolution. Geddes was a Darwinist, really, in a sense, and kind of the father of town planning to some extent in Britain. And there were books like this which resonated with the complexity approach. So the complexity approach came through, as it were, this transition from top down to bottom up in systems. And as part of that, we began to develop models which were more bottom up in some sense. The reason why I got interested in fractals, because to some extent, I think of fractals, power laws, all of these regularities that we see in systems as being really part of complexity, etc. Because one of the things about a fractal is that it's an object that scales similarly, and if you're in the spatial world, basically, it scales at different spatial scales, basically. You see similar patterns, basically. There is a degree of complexity in that very notion of something scaling in this rather complex way. So fractals was something that came onto the scene, and there were already lots of developments in thinking about cities and spaces and so on, which really related back to fractals. You can trace these things back to the 50s and 60s in quantitative geography to some extent. So that was the sort of way we began to evolve our models within the complexity approach. I should say that in terms of getting into this sort of stuff, the reason why we got into fractals was really very idiosyncratic, because we were building land use models all the way through, transport models all the way through the 1970s. And the biggest single problem was visualizing the output, basically, visualizing the output. So I decided when I went to Cardiff in 1979 to retrain myself in computer graphics. And in those days, in the 80s, early 80s, with computer graphics, fractals became very big. So fractals was a way of rendering an object with some degree of realism, in a sense. So when we were producing forecasts for planners about the future of cities and so on, rather than a sort of just a bunch of numbers related to a bunch of places, basically, then we used fractals to give it some sort of presentational sort of conviction, really, to some extent. So fractals came in through that way, and we soon discovered that these fractal ideas were very consistent with the idea of thinking of cities from the bottom up rather than thinking of them from the top down. And of course, I connected then with all the stuff going on at Santa Fe and so on in that sense. And so that's the way we got into it, really, in terms of thinking about cities. Top down to bottom up was the main transition through my early life, really, in that sense. And then, of course, because we were working technically with these models, the idea that we could think of cities as being self-similar, we could think of regular relationships in cities which generally manifested themselves as power laws, at least approximated by power laws, things of that sort. And these were already writ large to some extent in theories of locational analysis, in human geography and ecology and things of that sort, really.
Yes, and I remember you showing graphs of sizes of cities and how they scale.
Yeah. Yes,
They tended to fit in this kind of power law way, and there were occasional anomalies, weren't there?
Yes, that's right.
What did you learn from it as well? What did it give you?
One of the things that there are many explanations of why a power law emerges. That basically what we're talking about here is a system which is composed of objects of many different sizes. So the world system is cities. I don't know how many cities there are in the world. It depends, of course, on how we define a city and how small we go, basically. But I know there are 100 cities above 5 million in population. I read that the other day somewhere. And in other words, the idea of the power law is that there can really only be a very small number of big objects and a very large number of little. And of course, to be a big object, you have to be a little object first, really, in some sense. So there's a sort of asymmetry to this process. So the process of growth, if you like, a lot of growth models have been built where you start off with, a random distribution of city sizes, and then they begin to compete, basically, in some sense. And the way the competition works is that, big ones sort of become bigger and so on. I mean, obviously, cities can go up and down in size during this process, but generally speaking, what happens is that in the steady state, you get a power law with one big city and then two cities which are, let's say, half the size of the big city, three cities a third of the size, and so on. You have these regular relationships, which is referred to as Zipf's law, basically, after the scholar of this area in the 1940s, Zipf, and also a power law, sometimes called the rank size rule, basically, based on the notion that in certain instances, such as the United States, the largest city, if you take the largest city, which has been New York for all time, really, and divide it by 2, then you get the next size city. So New York's about 10 million. Divide it by 2 and you get Los Angeles, which is 5 million. Divide it by 3 and you get Chicago and one or two other cities, which are 3 million, and so on. And that's really the power law or the rank size rule.
Yes.
And so, in some senses, what I was showing, I think, that you referenced, this idea of this relationship, was that it's not in any sense perfect. It's nice to think, and there are some explanations by economists, basically, and statisticians, that you have a nice steady state process that leads to a kind of perfect relationship. And I mean, it was Paul Krugman, the economist, the Nobel Prize winner. Krugman said that the power law, or the rank size rule of cities, is the only iron law in the sciences, or in the physical sciences, or indeed in the social sciences. He said it's remarkable, the consistency of this thing. Of course, but it's still only an approximation, because you get situations like in Britain where you have a primate city, which is London. And this throws light on how you define cities. How do you define the boundary of these things, basically? And then you find places where the cities are not quite at the top of the hierarchy, aren't quite big enough, basically. And so you get these differences, in terms of the actual power law itself. And of course, the notion of a steady state, which continues remorselessly, basically, is an idealization that never happens. Occasionally, these things are punctured by quite dramatic changes. So the rise and fall of empires, for example, is very classic in terms of how one does that. So power laws are important in that sense, but they're also important because lots of other things in cities change with respect to inverse relationships. So, for example, the population density of a city, generally speaking, the activity, the population density, generally speaking, declines inversely as you move away from the center, basically. At one level, that's kind of obvious, really, but because you have more space, basically, for people to spread out, really, in that sense.
So a naive question, but what does it tell you that's useful to planners then? What do you do with that information? It's obviously very interesting, but in what way does it take you forward?
Well, in some senses, the biggest thing that it throws into question is the very definition of the city, right? Which, when you get down to it, is very ill-defined. Sort of how big is London, right? Now, London is in GLA, in the Greater London Authority, is about 8 million. But when we work with London and the Outer Met area, and that's about 15 million. Many people would take it further and say that London is really the southeast, basically. You probably need to include Oxford and Cambridge in that context. And Brighton and so on, that when you broaden it to that level, you're talking about nearly 20 million. And then there are people who say, well, some of the urban geographers at UCL have often said to me that, we've always known, that London is hard to define, that in some senses, people think that maybe the whole of England is one big city in that sense. Now, of course, having said that, if we look historically at cities, then they're growing. They're still growing in terms of spread. Population is still being attracted to cities, etc. And so if you take, for example, we have a project at the moment on the Greater Bay Area. The Greater Bay Area is the Pearl River Delta, which is Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Zhuhai and Macau, all of that region around. That's about 66 million people. So it's a sort of a mega city. And of course, it's cities within it. There's a hierarchy within it in that sense. So the rank size rule, rather than being a principle that we should meet in some sense, is a way of detecting differences in the way cities grow. And it also throws into doubt the notion that that when we look at cities, it's the classic example of where do you draw the boundary? Literally, where do you draw the boundary between the system and its environment, really, in that sense? And of course, as you just said earlier on, that things are getting ever more complex. The world is getting ever more complex. It's getting ever more connected in global and local terms in that sense. And really, in some senses, the idea of the way cities grow and the city sizes is very resonant with that very point of view. The big question is, how do we use these ideas to build better cities, really? And I'm afraid we really don't have many successful examples of where we've been able to do that in some sense. Most of the cities that have been planned in a limited sense have assumed that they're closed systems. If you look at the London new towns, for example, the London new towns go back to the first proposals for the new towns really were in the late 19th century with Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City and so on. And then it took about 50 years for the 10 or 12 new towns around London in a ring. And the rationale at the time, I mean, I was a student when some of these ideas were still floating around. The rationale at the time was that the new town should be self-contained. So the Harlows and the Stevenages of this world, that slum populations would be moved out to better housing in the new towns. Industry would be self-contained. People would not travel back to London. Well, of course, in many senses, that was a very simple-minded way of thinking about a connected world, really, because, of course, now they're just absorbed into the greater morass of things in a way. So the question you posed is a good one, right? How do you use all this stuff to actually improve cities? My view would be that the first and foremost thing is to make us aware of the difficulties of doing these things, etc., the problems involved in that sense.
Yes, and I guess the fact that there is a power law implies that there is an interrelationship between cities, that they're not closed systems. Because if they were closed, they wouldn't kind of, in some sense, be part of a wider system that you could model with power laws.
Yes.
And I guess it gives you some idea about growth and the interrelationship. If you've got a very big city, what's likely to happen around it? So
and of course the other big area that relates to complexity and cities is through the idea of networks. And as you know, there's been this great growth in the ideas about networks in the last 20 years or so, you know, the small worlds thing, the Batty link type stuff and so on. So the idea of networks, which is very resonant, I think, in for many years in sociology and some of the social networks, really got this massive regeneration of ideas for when statistical physicists got to work on networks about 20 years ago. And of course, if you look at networks in cities, they too are hierarchical. I mean, if you look at the plan of the main highways in a city, it looks like a tree. If you look at a tree from the top, or even from the bottom, from its roots, then you see these things spreading out in a dendritic type pattern, which is the distribution of energy, really, in some sense. So cities are like bodies in that sense, that the things are distributed through channels, the food, etc., the energy in that context. We have, for example, one of the projects we've done here is using Oyster card data to look at transportation flow. And because the data is of where people tap in and tap out is available on a second-by-second basis, we can build a model of where people are flowing to. And the model looks like the flow of blood. You start it off, and in the early morning, you see the morning peak rise up, and then it drops down a bit, and then the evening peak rising up, and they're all different, these peaks. And then in the late evening, a sort of little evening peak. And we've got a synthetic data set from the Oyster card that works over a month, basically. So we can see a number of trends. But it looks like blood flow. And of course, in a way, it is blood flow. It's the energy of the city pulsating out, in a sense, really. And that's very resonant with lots of ideas in complexity.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, brilliant. Well, my final question, Mike, which is really about the future, as you were saying earlier, we seem to live in increasingly complex and interconnected times with huge issues like climate change, pandemic, increasing inequality, the rise of populism. There's a lot going on in our world at the moment. And I think a question for a lot of people is what has complexity thinking got to offer this future, looking at what do we do to tackle some of these issues, and what should the research community be doing? What's needed from the great and the good in terms of how to tackle some of these issues. So perhaps you could try and answer that kind of question.
Yeah, I think we should connect complexity theory much more to the whole question of our ability to predict or not to predict, as the case may be. Because I think what complexity theory offers is a coherent view of the inability to predict, basically, and the investigation of different types of prediction in that sense. A good example of that is the pandemic, for example. In hindsight, people would say, yeah, well, we always thought there were pandemics going to come and so on, but nobody could predict the impact of it. And as the pandemic evolves, basically, then we're unable to predict almost what the next stage is, really, in some sense. That, 6 months ago, people would say, we're not really talking about the notion that we'd have to live with this pandemic for any length of time. But now people are increasingly saying it's going to be factored into all sorts of things over time. And in that sense, if you look at I don't know what you can see on your screen there, but if you can see behind me, I've got a sketch basically taken from a plan for London 2050 by some architects. And the sketch, in fact, is of the Bank of England and the City of London. If I move this way, you can just see that temple-looking building is the old Royal Exchange. It's the old Stock Exchange, not been used for a long time. But and then the wall behind it is the high-rise skyscrapers that have been built. This is 2015. They look a bit different now. And of course, this whole area is empty of people, right? It's completely empty. There's 650,000 people working the square mile each day. 650,000 don't go there every day and didn't do before the pandemic, but a very large, many thousands of people did, and they were delivered largely by public transport. All of that has been empty for a year, and whether people will go back, we just have no idea of what will happen. And this is almost unprecedented in some sense, but it's symptomatic of a complex system in some senses. So many different forces and links, as it were, that we don't quite understand. So I think the notion that linking, and a complexity theory, don't get me wrong, complexity theory is linked to ideas about prediction, I think, in some sense. And yet lots of definitions of complexity raise this question of prediction. But I think we could do a lot more to understand how far we could predict, because our inability to predict is not necessarily a bad thing, because we do have the ability to think about the future. And we need the ability to think about the future. It's just that we can't predict in the magical sense we used to think science was able to offer us in terms of prediction. And complexity theory really says it all, really, in that sense. Even the most arcane aspects of complexity theory in terms of nonlinear dynamics and so on really raised this notion in the last 50 years about bifurcations and chaos and catastrophes and things of that sort in a fairly graphic way. But I think prediction generally is something that complexity theory could move out to do. And in many senses, I think the project on complexity in this sense in the social world, which involves things like health and a whole variety of different aspects of society, is very resonant with this idea of our inability to predict. People use complexity because they feel that it gives them a better sense of being able to develop an understanding, and even if that understanding is about the limits to what we can do with knowledge in that sense. So that's one of the big things I think complexity theory could do, definitely.
Yes. And I think it kind of both encourages people to think more widely. So people working in pandemics were kind of predicting there might be a pandemic, but it's outside the remit of the economist. Exactly. Whereas the biggest thing that's happened to the economy is the pandemic, so to speak.
Indeed,
It encourages you to think more widely.
Absolutely.
But I think in the way that perhaps the government have actually been doing in terms of setting milestones out of lockdown, but making the point to people, but we have to check at the data, we have to see where we've got to, is a kind of good both and about prediction. It's saying we'll have a plan, but we reserve the right to change our plan depending on changing circumstances
Exactly. Yeah.
evidence. So that's already shifting a kind of mindset, both politically and more generally, about how do you edge forward in a complex world. So I think that's very true. It's starting to creep into practice, and more could be done. And what do you think the academic community should be doing? You know, what do you think is needed to kind of keep these topics alive and moving forward?
Well, I think actually that's a hard question, right? Because complexity theory is developed pretty extensively. I mean, if you link it to the systems approach beforehand, then in many senses it's more flexible in terms of the general notion about complexity. There's greater flexibility in adapting complexity theories to individual systems than the systems approach in that sense. It's not just a matter of a difference of degree, really, between systems and complexity in that sense. And so it's had a good run in many ways. And I think one of the great successes is that it has permeated a wide variety of different subject areas, basically. See, the systems approach was never really developed in physics. It was consistent with most of physics, and it was consistent with a lot of economics. But when you look back, you can't find a book written a systems approach to physics or a systems approach to economics. You can write a systems approach to cities, a systems approach to psychology, a systems approach to sociology, and so on. And in that sense, complexity theory, I think, has been very successful at bridging these gaps, basically, in a sense, bringing ideas together in that sense. Mm-hmm. It's a bit open-ended to some extent in terms of, if you ask me, well, what would we do in terms of a curriculum for complexity, then probably complexity theory has to be really part of our new scientific understanding, if you like, with science with a small s, really, in the sense of, you know, assuming social science and science, so a more formal understanding, really. So complexity theory should probably be a part of a lot of different views about how we integrate different areas of knowledge in that sense. So the multidisciplinary perspective is also part of that as well, in some senses. So I think there needs to be development along those lines. I think there is already. I don't have any potted view about what complexity theory will be like in 10, 20, 30 years' time. I think these things go through stages of maturation in some senses. I think that there are some big changes afoot in terms of automation in society and so on, information technologies and so on. And complexity theory has not quite addressed some of those issues in some senses. I suppose there are elements of complexity theory that are very central to that, such as the idea of networks and globalization and integration and linkage and all that sort of stuff. But generally speaking, the notion of an automated society, a platform-based society where we're using information technologies in the way we are using them now, there isn't much you can read in complexity theory about that kind of thing in that sense. So I think that complexity theory should increasingly be aware of all of these other things that are happening, really. It's not a critique of complexity in the sense of these things may well happen anyway, basically, as it spreads out.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. It's you know, it can go there are many things needed. I think we're talking about the kind of the worldview and the attitude towards the complex world is changing in a more kind of philosophical or just sociological way. But there are also some you know, the issues of big data, the issues of climate change modeling, you know, the issues of, as you said, of cities and automation that need addressing too. But that's lovely, Mike. It's really nice to talk to you, and that's been a really, really interesting review. So thank you ever so much.